Howdy, welcome back to the DevSecOps track at the DevOps Online Summit. I'm Mark Peters, and here with me today is Tracy Bannon. She's a senior architect for MITRE and a senior principal with MITRE's Corporation Software Engineering Division. She's been doing this for a long time, and I say doing this, I say working with government, integrating with government, making sure government has the best tools, with her specialty being solution application architecture, emphasizing cloud native, cloud refactoring, service-oriented API architecture, and then DevSecOps at the end of that chain. So if you have any questions about how to do it, Tracy is really your go-to for those architecture solutions and those architecture integrations. Experience across multiple technologies, proven ability to lead technical teams and deliver solutions. So today we're going to have a chat with something I've been doing for just a little bit of time, but with more government experience, and that's DevSecOps for government, how it really differs from integrating security to the commercial world. So Tracy, with that, what can you start? It is Tracy, right? It's not.
It is. Oh, I go by Trace. My mom, we never used the Y, so Trace or Tracy, either works. I answer to both. So yeah, I appreciate the introduction. So
the famous book, right? Why ask why?
Yeah.
Start with why.
Start with why. Start with why. It's interesting that I didn't start out with a goal of doing DevSecOps. It actually drives me bananas when people say they're going to do DevSecOps, because it was a natural evolution from the things that I was doing. I was designing systems, delivering systems, pushing them into production. But Mark, I don't know if you've heard the story that I am dev married to ops. My husband and I, early in our careers, worked with AccuWeather. I was in engineering, he was in operations, and I learned that people called our house when there was a problem. And what it gave me was an opportunity to work with him directly. He needed to show me what was going on in production, but I needed to help him navigate what was coming. And so it really educated me on how dev and ops needed to work together before we had that term, DevOps. And it became what I did in order to deliver systems into production. So CI/CD, it's all the rage, but I've been doing that since probably 2005, 2006 in bits and spurts and parts and pieces. In government, gosh, it's been a lot of interesting conversation on how government can just do DevOps. We can look at the exemplars that are out there, and what's driving a lot of government crunchiness is that there's a lack of examples, because there are differences. Now, there are some things, I call it sameness. There's sameness between government and commercial, but there are snowflakey differences between them. And the examples, Netflix, when I'm working with a jet plane and I'm delivering software out into a naval vessel, I'm probably not delivering 40 releases each day. I'm probably looking at doing something a little bit different.
So I find when I work with them that the problem is a lot of the legacy stuff, right? That there's not a lot of the government that really needs to do that level of construction. In one of the comments, I used to work with fighter squadrons, right? The fighter squadrons always said, their rules are written in blood. They have flight rules about flight safety because somebody died. So, which makes sense. But you have this high level of administration as everything tries to match that standard. And then you get a lot of these compliance rules that you can't make in time for DevOps without completely rethinking the problem.
Well, boy, there are a couple things to unpack there. You're right that there are different problem spaces, and that is one of the unique things about government. The problem space is a little bit different. Now, you'll run into groups like SpaceX that are working for the government, and they are dealing with some of the policy issues and the fielding issues and the operational issues. When you're dealing with mission critical, you do have to slow down a little bit. It doesn't mean that you can't leverage key capabilities of DevOps, but it does mean that you have to take a breath and figure out what's really necessary. Automated testing, great, awesome. Infrastructure as code, sometimes not. What about when I am writing embedded software that's going directly onto, and that happens with DevOps in the government space. One thing that you brought up that I'd really like to tease out a little bit more is on olive coding. That's what I call the brownfield and the greenfield. Right? You're right. There's not a lot, I would say not as much greenfield. Sometimes there is, but the greenfield tends to be at the edges. It tends to be the new add-ons. There's decades of amazing software out there. There's decades of old legacy software out there. not facing the reality that there's so much brownfield. Even with a new greenfield application, there's integrations to the brownfield. So how do you deal with that in a DevSecOps world? Doesn't mean that you can't. It means that we don't take a look at the pizza box or the pizza box teams. I don't have seven folks over here in a corner that are doing something, interacting with someone, with their end user, their single end user to rapidly do this. These are things at scale. There are rules, regulations, policy, and the cyber aspect, as you know, Mark, is highly critical, right? Going fast matters, but not at the risk of introducing some type of cyber challenge.
I get split on that one. I think if you go fast enough, then everybody's catching up with you. And you can be at the front edge. And if you slow it down, you actually give other people the opportunity to catch what you're doing.
I think it's a balance, right? All of it. So we'll put on our agile hat. Everything is about incrementally changing and adjusting levers as we go. That's the hardest part of agility. That's the hardest part of DevSecOps, is continuously being able to tweak things. In government, we're used to a policy that gets implemented and it's in place. And that is what you move toward. You move towards that policy that's not unchanging. It may be checklist driven, right? And that is a culture change. I will tell you that part of the challenge with the government space is the culture change. There are leaders who get there's value in doing this magical DevSecOps thing. So go do DevSecOps. And then what? And then what, right? So getting to the operators, the people on the ground, the people who are doing, there's a groundswell. There's a grassroots movement of folks who want to do it. But then you have all the middle structures, all of those middle structures.
And I tell you, I think a great point. You've got your bullet here, talking about lacking a common definition. As you see these requests come out from the government, they say, hey, we want DevSecOps. We want a team to do DevSecOps. Well, by the way, we want a configuration change board, and we want an engineering review board, and we want solid configuration management. And they each have to have teams, and they're going to have separate teams. And they're going to, you say, well, I've got this, this study, this Nicole Forsgren report, and it says change panels are actually detrimental to your process of producing new things. Are you sure you want that? They said, oh yeah, we want this, but we want to keep the legacy part still in place.
Yeah, there's a lot of nervousness there. So if you can track back to why did they want to do it in the first place? What was the thing that they were trying to accomplish when they set that board up? It's traceability, trackability. There's a little bit of scapegoating. There's a little bit of blame skating, but in the end, it's about risk reduction. So if you can show and articulate how you're addressing risk and achieving mission value, measurable mission value, those things, there starts to be a difference. Like I don't know if you can see the screen that I was sharing. These are a number of different areas that are same and different. The government in the past, and I would say by and large now, they've been at oversight. They haven't been building and designing themselves. They've outsourced that. They needed to outsource that. They've been outsourcing that since the last time they built guns themselves, in World War II. So they've done all of this outsourcing. And now there's a desire to take that back. So, okay, I need to outsource less. Maybe I'll start some software factories. Sometimes they're calling them depots. I'll give them tools and I'll say, go fast, just go fast. And they don't yet have the muscle memory and they're not used to it. So I might have a group of passionate people that are trying to do this dojo-esque type thing, but the surroundings, to your point, the oversight pieces are still there. Mark, have you also found in this effort to stand up change boards and other types of boards that there's this big effort to have DevSecOps teams, not development teams, these are your pipeline teams. So they take in DevSecOps and they now abstract it and they put out a contract and they're handing it to a DevSecOps team to build and maintain the pipeline while the developers are over here, right? The developers are over here.
So I've seen them with both, and I've seen the developers involved in the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And the biggest objection I've seen is that the government wants to put people in places in those pipelines as part of that team when they're coming in from a full government, a civilian or military aspect, and they want to do all the fun things that the developers and the other people are doing, right? You can either do oversight or you can build it. And you cannot do both oversight and build it in the same person because you simply don't have the experience.
I would tend to agree. I'd tend to agree that you can't do both. Not that unique individual.
You went back to your file sharing example.
Oh, okay. Let me see.
That's all right. Temporary hitch. There you go.
All right. Let's see if that. All right. There we go. Okay. So Mark, there are some things that the government really shares with industry, and I want to talk through a couple of different areas and explore these with you. One of the things that I see that is tremendously the same, you just touched on, is what I call that thirst for innovation. They are both really bent on, in a good way, passionate about getting leading edge or driving what the new edges are. Bio-machine augmentation, low code, no code has a place and a purpose. AI, analytics, ML, they are so much passion. And what custom development was, I use the term was, 8 or 9 years ago, is not what custom development is now. We've always talked about in the government about modularity. Okay, I'm going to incorporate a business rules engine. So I'll get that engine and I'll incorporate that component piece. But now we really have the capability to be stitching together. So a lot of what our custom folks are doing is stitching things together. And there's a passion because there's such a smorgasbord of amazing things out there, right? For folks to be stitching together. So custom dev now becomes for the unique use cases, the truly unique use cases. But there is absolutely a sameness between the government and between industry. How do they get the innovation going? And DevSecOps, in the right context and with the right surrounds, it can be amazing for innovation and discovery, right? Because it enables me to, I don't want to say fail fast because I hate that term. It enables me to learn fast, to learn really fast. There's a sameness there, but I would say that leads us into kind of what a real difference is between the two. And you and I talked about that, and that is the problem space. Generally, the government manages acquisition. You mentioned this before. It's not all greenfield. It's a lot of brownfield. There's a lot of hardware and software integration. The literature that's around this is mostly on cloud. And I can tell you point blank, you can't do cloud for everything in the government. You can't. If I have what's called an austere edge, if I am on the battlefield, I'm not depending on the cloud for some of the pieces and parts of this. I have war fighters, I've got government workers, I've got a lot of different types of scientists that are involved. Now that's similar to industry, maybe not the war fighter, but the types of data. Government systems have to protect a lot of different data. So there's similarities to some parts of commercial, but not at the same time. I'm a financial institution. I deal with financials. I don't necessarily deal with classified and moving to a classified situation with PII.
That brings up a great story, which I just have to digress for a second. We talked about that austere edge, right? So when I was in the Air Force, one of my jobs was I was updating data. And I was updating the geographic data for all those digital maps and digital imagery that everybody was using. Well, that meant that myself and a sergeant picked up a hard drive, got on a plane, and flew all over Central Asia to actually hand deliver those hard drives and swap them out with the new hard drives because there wasn't any pipeline that could handle I think it was 200 terabytes at the time was the update, right, that we were delivering on these drives. So you had to hand deliver. And that's kind of an example of that austere edge you talk about when you talk about, well, if it's the same thing, how do I get a new update out to that software? It's got to be that big.
Well, and imagine that doesn't immediately go away. Now, there are amazing changes and evolutions that are happening in the network connectivity and the comms world. Things that I don't even dare try to understand because the super smart folks are dealing with how those bits and bytes are getting moved around. But your point that there's a time where something is stamped, where something is placed onto a disk or a drive and is physically moved, that still happens. And part of the, they called that DDIL. And I have to remember what DDIL stands for, but it is disconnected, disadvantaged, low, high latency, low connectivity situations. That exists. The only other place that I've seen that in commercial is actually with cruise lines. When I was a couple of years ago, I was doing some work with Azure Stack, and we were experimenting. I was on the government side, and I was working with the Navy, and we were talking with some folks who were dealing with Azure Stack on cruise lines. So how are you doing your sync? How are you prioritizing when there's a low latency or a really disconnected situation, and you get a limited tranche of bandwidth? How are you deciding what gets moved and what gets prioritized? That plays into your design, but also that plays into the DevOps aspects of this, because how am I going to deliver software updates? Am I going to deliver software updates, right? There are decisions. You know this, Mark. There are hard decisions that need to be made about whether or not you're going to go ahead and deliver new software updates at different points in time.
And the government has the added problem with the user, right? That they have to get the users trained after they deliver new software updates. And we've actually seen where the company delivered a new release for a weapon system. They were ready to go and add more features and make it better and remove the tech debt. And the government wasn't ready to do the training associated with that piece.
Well, I'm hopeful that one of the things that you and I and other ambassadors can start to change over the course of the next couple of years is helping folks to get those small bite changes. If we're leveraging small batches and we are intentional about the changes that we're making, imagine that a user gets used to it like using their iPhone, right? They're getting that app store mentality, that update every so often, not daily, but what is the right size bite to roll out new features to them? And how do you make it so that, and this gets into the UI, UX, the human factors and experience, how do you make it so that they don't have to have heavy training, but it's more discoverable? That's really difficult. It's actually very difficult. And it's making it difficult for the definition of what the acquisition process looks like. How familiar are you, Mark, with the work that you've done with government acquisition and what it means?
I spent a couple of years doing acquisitions. So we were the Intel support for acquisitions, which meant we had to learn everything, but we didn't get credit because we were on the Intel side, not actually acquisition branded professionals.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. You know this, that most of government software is still contracted for and acquired. And there has been, they're on the defense side of the house, there is something called the Acquisition University, Defense Acquisition, DAU. You essentially get a college degree. It's akin to getting a master's in just how to define and acquire the software. Ms. Lord, who was the head of, I think it was in September of 2020, came out and said, you know what, this is too hard for these really seasoned individuals, and it's taking us too long to get more acquisition folks in the mix so that they can even think about, let alone how we've been acquiring in the past. Now we want to think about DevOps. We want to think about agility. How does that change the contract mechanism? All of those things mean that there's a tremendous transformation happening at this minute in government about using adaptive frameworks, not tech frameworks, adaptive acquisition frameworks to get smarter about how they go through their work. Transferring risk has been something that, through an acquisition process, you transfer risk, right, to whoever is delivering to you. Sometimes, especially on the defense side of this, I don't get the luxury of transferring the risk. I can only give so much of that to the contractor or to whoever it's awarded to. And the final point on that, Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. We talked about there being different teams, but think about it when they're actually contracted differently. I've got an architecture group that's been contracted. I've got a development team, a testing team, a security team, an operations team, all of them being separately contracted. Yeah, go ahead and put together a DevSecOps team. You go ahead and do that.
So the first one is I usually get a good laugh. I have a slide in one of those stacks that shows the simplified DoD process with the A, B, C, D, E and how we overrun it. Like each of these is a multi-year, multi-step, and you just get, and they want to do DevSecOps.
And they want to do DevSecOps.
I actually found some success in a recent team I was with, and they moved from the previous contract had been exactly like you said. It had done sustainment, maintenance, and development as 3 separate contracts. They didn't like to talk to each other. So the new contract blended it all under one. And one contract took charge of all those things with subcontractors. So they were able to get the cross-functional teams and were able to get that type of integration to move forward. Now, I still think one of the hiccups is that they then integrated the government engineers onto those teams, and they kind of reverted to the, we're going to have an architecture team that's going to develop the architecture that then developers are going to use. And because those government engineers had been doing it for years, they wanted to keep their hands in fixing the problem, right? So it works, but you got to get some separation. You got to be able to say, I want responsibility. The same as actually you do when you work in the government acquisition field, that they get too much separation from the operators and they don't actually see the urgency or what those operators are doing on a day-to-day basis, right? I talked to a guy that was working in northern Iraq, and they had a fight and they were having problems picking up snipers. And he called back and he said, hey, this is what we need. And they said, okay. And they picked him up, they sent him back to Georgia. They had him go look at the team, look at the scopes that were available, buy a bunch, custom fit them, and be back on the combat scene inside of a week, right? With the options they needed to fix it,
right,
as a fast acquisition model. But as soon as it slows that down, we don't get that anymore. And that's the same type of answer they're looking from DevSecOps, but they don't have the experience to get there on any side.
Well, I think you bring up a couple of additional points. And the workforce is very different, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about. I'm gonna flip forward. One of the things that you're talking about is the fact that there's all this focus on the dev part of it with software. I don't know if you've noticed, ops is often a different group altogether. So that idea of a continuous feedback loop, that ops is part of the mix. The way the funding works for DevOps, especially on the defense side, is that you've got development that's being built up. You've got fast pipelines and they're starting to do things more quickly, but they don't have the operator as a part of it. And ultimately, who's going to be fielding it into production isn't necessarily there. And so I jokingly say, but there's some truth to this. There's DevSec, wait, SecOps. And I'm sure that you've seen that, right? I'm sure that you've seen that.
There's the challenge of, we kind of mean different things when we say operators. Yes. When the military says operators, they mean the guy who's flying the jet, the guy who's out there on the boat patrolling, and not the guy who's actually running the code, right? All he wants to know is that when he pushes the button, it works. And he understands a little of the background. A fighter pilot understands his missile. He understands how the logic works. He understands how the file goes, but he can't write code to develop it, nor can he operate the code. He just knows the list of checks that goes through his machine.
Exactly.
So you've got to make sure that you have the right operator, that when he calls back and has a problem, he gets the person who understands the code about it and not somebody else who just talks to the machine.
Well, and I think that you actually bring up one of our original points, is that the definition is bunked up. One of the hardest things has been, I'm doing work directly with the Air Force right now. And every time we have a conversation, and one of the programs I work with is F-35, and we talk to, there are 6 PMOs with massive PMOs within this giant organization. And that definition of what an operator is has been hardcore gnashing on what that is. What is DevSecOps? Oh, well, it just means that you're in the cloud. Well, does it really mean that I'm in the cloud? Am I waterfalling in the cloud? What is it that we're trying to accomplish, right? DevSecOps, and this is my nerd-splain for the moment, is such an umbrella. There's so many different pieces and parts of it that it's not just picking up a pipeline and running with it. It's the culture to people, process, technology, culture, all of those together, security undergirding the whole thing. That lack of definition is a biter. I usually start out an engagement having the conversation. What do you think it is? So that at least, if I might even not agree with what their definition is, but as long as we have codified, here's what we think it is, right? Single page. This is what we think it is. then we can move against something, because that helps us to get to the metrics. It helps us get to how are we delivering value, measuring what the value is, all those things that we're not really good at when it comes to DevSecOps in the government yet. Now I want to take us back for a second at something that I wanted to get your opinion on, because you've been working in this space for quite a while. I've worked across government for about 20 years, but I've done state and local as well as federal. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Government in the past has been that oversight. They haven't necessarily been the implementers, but there's a real intent right now to help people, to help the government get trained up to be as technical in those same roles as their contractor counterparts. But I'm also seeing that the age of the workforce in the federal government is going up, and the age in industry is not. So do you think that there is a workforce challenge? Do you see a workforce challenge, Mark? I see one, but do you see a workforce challenge in the government space?
I think there's absolutely a workforce challenge. I don't think the age necessarily has anything to do with it, because I think a lot of the people that you talk to are older, are perfectly capable of retraining. Mm-hmm. I think it has to do with the cultural mindset of mm-hmm. what the training means. Yep. Like you mentioned, that you have to be willing, if you're going to commit to oversight, you have to be willing to do oversight. If you're going to commit to implementation, you have to be willing to do implementation and let somebody else do the oversight. And once they get excited and they get retrained, they think that that means I can do the implementation, right? And I can work all the way through the piece. You see the same thing, you mentioned cyber, and a lot of cyber units that go out and they get information and they're working for NSA or for somebody else, right? And they want to solve the problem once they get it. They said, no, that's not yours, right? You're a collector. All you do is collect. I don't want you to do anything else other than to get the best collection possible, right, and then hand it off. So, once the government gets the best requirements or their best concept of a feature, they need to hand it off and come back and say, we like this. This is good. Let's keep doing more of this, instead of getting down in the weeds and actually working the problem and saying, well, we think, from line 35 to 45, you could have a smoother integration. If you contract it out or you have a different team, let them do that part.
Right. Let me tease out just a little bit more about the older employees and why I think that matters. It's not a capability or competency thing at all. Zero. Net, I find amazing and intelligent and passionate individuals on both sides. The difference is the culture change. I'm finding that if I'm bringing somebody in newer in career, that I am more able to impact their culture and help culture build, and that I have a little more pushback on culture change with folks who are more ingrained in their careers. So if you have the muscle memory, 15 years of muscle memory doing it in a certain way, change is hard. And when something goes wrong, we fall back to how we did it before. What's the old adage that to get rid of a bad habit, don't try and just completely make a metamorphic change. Figure out how you can replace that particular bad habit in that same slice of time when that occurs with a better habit.
Right.
Not a perfect habit, but a better habit. That's the difficulty I see with an older, more experienced workforce, is truly, how do I get that? How do I relax that muscle memory and get them to run, throw, swim a different way?
Well, it's like you said, it's time and position, right? That they're less inclined to be collaborative, that they've spent all this time in a hierarchical waterfall. So you're like, I don't need you to be in charge. All I need you to do is sit there and talk on the same level as everybody else. It's like, well, but they're a GS10, or they're a contractor, and I've got oversight for this person. It's like, well, but that's what we need you to do.
What's interesting is that I bring that up as a way that it makes government a little unique, that they have proportionately more folks who are later stages of their career, not end stage, but later stages, just more advanced. I'm newer in career, tends to go to industry right now, but something that's really the same between both of them is Conway's law. Conway's law, it's the same. All right. I'm bending the, I've got an organization, and the way that I start to deliver software really does start to resemble how I'm structured. So I'm a big advocate. I jokingly say, and I don't know where I heard this, the reverse Conway maneuver. So how do I take the work at hand and bend the organization or organizations? How do I get it to match the work that has to be done instead of what's going on right now, which is I trend towards what I've done in the past. That's the same. It doesn't matter. Any of the work that I've done in the commercial space, I see the same thing. If they're already structured a certain way, they will start to drift towards architecture here and development. And this type of development, I might have a back-end systems development team over there. And I've got you remember when we went through the web methods epic? And we created these web methods teams. Was that about 10 years ago or a little bit more? And all of a sudden we had a bottleneck. But the architecture started to match that was where I had and how I was building software and how I was delivering software started to match exactly how I was structured. So that's irrespective of government or commercial.
So one of the great things you hear with the Air Force lately, right, is they talk about ATO, or the authorization to operate. They talked about the continuous ATO. How do we get this to a continuous model? And you read their reference for the continuous ATO. It says, all we need you to do continuous is just deliver these things on a daily basis. Just give us the information, give us the logs, and give us the checks, and you'll be continuous. Absolutely, forever and ever. And by the way, we'll check that on a yearly basis to make sure that you could stay continuous. And you look at them and says, well, how is that different from you just giving me 2 years to operate where you don't look at my stuff until 2 years? Oh, well, it's continuous.
Yeah. So what is that word that I think you were using? I can't remember the exact reference from The Princess Bride, but that word you're using, I do not think it means what you think, right? It's that kind of a moment. Define continuous. Well, I would say the same thing with continuous integration. Define continuous. Given what you're working on, continuous might not mean that every code, every LOC is getting checked in and automatically there's a full build against it. Continuous might mean that I've picked 3 times a day. You define all those things. What is continuous? But I would say that if you're getting into weeks and months or years, continuous does not mean that thing that you said that it meant before.
Right.
I mean, you probably dealt with, on the defense side, RMF packages as well. To get to ATO, you've got to follow this risk management framework. I had an epic failure, not of the software, but of the process. A couple of years ago, met with and the RMF team that was going to be evaluating said, guys, we'd like you to come to the table with us early on so that you can get exposed to the architecture and the engineering. So we're not going to just hand you completed, ready to go, ready to be audited type, and we want you to be a part of the effort. And I got to tell you, it sounded good, sounded great, but the framework itself doesn't lend itself yet. They're working towards it, doesn't lend itself towards being involved in the overall DevSecOps, the pipeline, in the effort in the SDLC. It is still very, very sequential. And that was an epic failure. We tried. We spent about 6 months trying to work through that, but did not have enough bandwidth to help with that culture change that was necessary to make it a bit more continuous in that particular. So I got my wings were a bit singed on that one. We tried. So
we had an instance that worked very well doing exactly the same thing. And that's one of those cultural challenges that you have anecdotal evidence of DevSecOps working, but It doesn't work the same way. There's not a lift and shift that you can do from one to the other, because we put our security guys into our teams, but we used a transparent knowledge workflow through DI2E. And when it came time to get the artifacts, we knew right where they were.
Yeah. So
we didn't have to ask anybody to prepare them. We just dumped them over to the evaluators, and they were pretty happy with that for the most part. But it all depends on what they want and how they want it.
And that's a part of it. And it depends on it gets back to the contract mechanisms and what's the duration of their contracts. Sometimes they're coming onto contracts, or they have a calendared time where they've been allocated to deal with you. So if you're asking them to get involved 4 months before they anticipate seeing finalized products, it's a harder lift. Doesn't mean it can't be done.
Well,
Go Go ahead, Mark.
We actually found for the timeline on their policy said don't submit any earlier than 60 days before the expiration date, because we need scans within 60 days of that time to justify everything.
Yeah.
And then they couldn't make it happen. And, the PMOs come back, well, why don't we have an extension? Why don't we have this? Why did you not submit it until 60? Why didn't you submit it 4 months out? Well, they said they didn't want it until they had the current data.
It's culture change. It is, and I had a slide that we just talked about all of these different things. We are trying to help them from a culture perspective. It's a heavy lift. There are folks that have been inspired by team structures that need to be changed. The organizations need to change. We have to help them. There are some interesting unionization considerations, negotiations that may have to happen. I was working with a non-defense, one of the major agencies about 4 years ago, and we were working through automation, and we were told to stand down until there could be union negotiations, because there was fear. There was a lot of fear that you're going to automate my job away. And what we really had to work on was showing them how we're going to help you to not focus on those mundane tasks that can be automated and therefore audited. And you can go do the fun stuff. You can solve the big challenges. That's another part of the culture change. I think that there's some of that in commercial, but I do see that much more in the government space, given that some of these organizations are massive, right? You've got IT shops that have 1,800 or 2,000 people or more. And it's tremendous. It's tremendous. Did you see the same thing in your experience, Mark?
I did. And you can part directly to the budget cut back in the early 2000s, where they cut a whole bunch of the cyber professionals in the Air Force. And I think, honestly, personally, one of the reasons was the security guys and the system guys have been telling them for years, we need to buy this new server and it will replace so many individuals on the job. We need to buy the new server. It will replace so many individuals. And it came down to it. And they were over budget. And they said, all right, you've been telling us, we've added it up. Now get rid of the bodies. And they rooted through the entire cyber field because they'd been telling them that they didn't need as many bodies. And they still did, because they needed the bodies to do the new stuff, the automation, like the good DevOps university, right? The automation frees the humans to do human things.
Right.
Which is what we want. We want to move humans up to that higher level.
Exactly. And there's additional.
But you got to plan for that.
Well, and I think we're in the right place at the right time to help with the transformation. So when folks talk about transition is when I know the starting place and the ending place, and it's well defined. And so I can chart a roadmap for a transition roadmap. But transformation means that the culture piece of it has to get honest, dedicated focus. That means that our North Star, where we think we're going, may have to change. And the steps that we have to take to get there may have to change. And pivoting is not something that necessarily that all government agencies are doing well. Some are really in earnest trying to do this. And don't get me wrong, it's not as though the government is devoid of amazing DevSecOps capabilities. It's not. Is it widespread everywhere? Nope. Is it in infancy yet? I would say in I would say that it's still largely in its infancy, but that's a good place for it to be, because before the bad habits start, right? In a DevSecOps world, can we help to better influence a better adoption of sustainable? There's a lot of work that has to be done to getting to defining what value is, because there's still I need to do DevSecOps. And I come back, and the first question when somebody says, I need to do DevSecOps. Okay, tell me why. What is it? And tell me why. As long as you
want to deliver every day.
I want every day. Really? Do you really need it every day? What are you trying to accomplish? What I'm finding is that the story is very different for each one of them, and which is okay. But that also tailors what it looks like. Do I immediately just adopt a pipeline? Well, not if I'm brownfielding and I've been successfully delivering and I'm in sustainment and I've been doing that for a while. What is your goal in applying DevSecOps principles there? Oh, is there a quality issue? Well, let's address that through automated testing. Let's see what we can do there. Is there a security risk, right? Do I need greater stability? And so I need to look at IAC and the, and immutable servers and, right, what is it that I need to apply and why? Is it that I'm not delivering the right things? Then I have a culture issue that I need to get more integration with the end users and to be able to better determine what their needs are. You know this. This is a very intensive, communicative culture. And we have a historic tendency with government that we have handoffs, right? And it's those handoffs where I am no longer responsible. I have given it to you, Mark. You are now responsible. Here you go. Go and take the next step. So it's hard for us to be like a pivot table. It's hard for us to go from that sequential to having many things happening in parallel and being able to reprioritize. The reprioritization message is probably one of the most difficult to take up to executive leaders who've not necessarily bought in or who are just learning. Because when you say, I've got 100% confidence in the first 2 sprints, and the third sprint, I'm at a 90% confidence, but I've got to figure this thing out. And as I'm projecting out the roadmap for 18 months, the further out I get, the lower my confidence is in the estimation of what it is we really need. Well, that's hard. That's gut-wrenching for some folks, don't you think?
I do. And the other half of that is you say, if you don't mess with it, if you come in and do pivots, your confidence estimate drops significantly lower than that. I have 100% confidence in our ability to do what we just told you we would do based on what you ask us for. Every time you come in and stick your fingers in, that's going to change and it's going to reset our whole beginning.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so I'll give you one thought of mine and I'll let you come in for final thoughts since I think we're hitting the end of our time, right? As I've told some of these government DevOps, I said, the biggest thing you can do if you want to do this is tell them what you want and then give them 3 to 6 months to do it and don't ask any questions. Don't ask for status updates. Don't make them give you file reporting. Don't make them come to your PMRs. Don't make them come to your other stuff. All their stuff is going to be transparent and their workflows are out there. And if you have to look, fine, but don't ask questions. Don't stick your fingers in and try to change things.
I'm really glad that we've had some time today to talk, Mark. We haven't
it's been great.
this big a tranche of time together, so we're going to have to connect again. I think in closing, there are lots of ways that government and commercial are the same. When I think about the passion of the individuals who are involved, everybody wants to do good things. It's not as though folks are just sitting back saying, you know what, I'm just not feeling like doing anything cool today. People want and have passion to deliver value. That focus on value is one of the places that I think you're going to see a lot of foot stomping over the next 2 years because we haven't really defined it very well. You're seeing a rise in industry, government and commercial, in value stream mapping. There's a new value stream consortium that has kicked off. Folks are hyper focused on metrics and moving away from adopting DORA because DORA said, and Nicole and Jean, good things, but how do we build on that? And define what value is and help with there being performance measures and metrics that actually matter to what we talked about earlier, to answering and addressing why, what it is you want to do and why you want to do it. So I'm actually really excited that we're in this role at this time, Mark, because I think we can help our government clients, our sponsors, the folks that we're working with, and help industry to play a part in addressing all these challenges. So thank you again for the invite chat this morning. And thank you. I think it's pretty bright and early where you are. So thanks for getting up so early.
That's good. Well, by the time they play it, it won't be as early anymore. Right? We actually get to the online summit at the end of April.
Yeah,
we'll be in
all good. Bye,
so everyone, thanks for joining us. This has been Tracy Bannon with DevSecOps for Government.